This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. Hey, it's James Taylor, and welcome to The Creative Life. And in this show, we talk with some of the most creative writers, musicians, artists, entrepreneurs, and academics. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with Tosha Silver, who is a wonderful writer on all things spiritual. And we speak about her process of getting to speak at Google, about writing with humor, Sufi poetry, and much, much more. Hey, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have Tosha Silver. And Tosha is a San Francisco-based author and teacher on yogic philosophy. After graduating from Yale with a degree in English literature, her life took a very different path. And 30 years later, she has taught people around the world to live outrageous openness. She is the author of Change Me Prayers, Outrageous Openness, and a forum called Living Outrageous Openness. So, Tosha, welcome to the show.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here.
So, share with our listeners what's going on in your world just now.
Right this minute. Well, at the moment, we just finished a long period of the book Change Me Prayers, which is really about surrendering to the inner divine and the inner intuition, really. We just sort of finished a long period of promotion for that, and now I'm back to teaching a lot and running the forum online that teaches people how to live all this stuff and contemplating what the next book will be.
And so, I mentioned at the start here, you went the kind of classic type A type thing of going to Yale and doing all that thing, and then things changed for you. You got this interest in spirituality and just in yogic philosophy. How did that all come about? Where did it all start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what started to happen early on, probably when I was in college, is that I actually went there to learn to be a writer, because that was really what I wanted from the time I was very young. And one of the things that happened in these very high-powered classes where, to be honest, everybody was busily ripping each other's writing apart, and, it was quite ferocious, is I think that was one of the first things that started to push me into this place of going, I think there is a gentler, deeper way to let the creativity unfold than that kind of, rapacious, ripping, competitive, going at each other. And, that really didn't fit my nature. I mean, I got a lot of good professors there, but I think the entire experience of what you're saying, that sort of type A, go get it, make it happen, work harder, as the years unfolded there, I really started to feel the desire for an alternative. And that actually led me into this spiritual route, which wasn't religious, was really wanting to learn to connect to that force on the inside, which is love, and which I actually think is what true creativity emerges from. It doesn't come from force and push, right? So that's kind of what happened. And then ironically, it took a long time for me to start writing again. I was sort of, went into the spiritual world and started, people wanted me to teach and all this stuff happened. And it really took many, many years, actually even of directly beginning to, dare I say, pray to that inner love and saying, let me write. I'm a writer. Let me get this out. Because what I was really finding is that fixation on doing it from the ego, I'll be great, I'll get it out, really creates pretty crappy art.
Yeah.
Right? And when that's relinquished, and then there's this attention turned on the inside, like, if there's a way that I can be of service to the collective good, if there's a message that the universe wants to bring through me, that's really when it started to happen, when I started to make requests like that on the inside. And it was really quite the opposite of everything I was taught at Yale. So,
and that very first book that you wrote, I mean, where did some of the ideas come from that book? Were these things that had been just kind of floating around for a while, and you were involved in terms of teaching them one-on-one or with groups, and you just felt you needed to put this down in some kind of written form? Or was it you were maybe wanting to explore something that you weren't necessarily teaching with other people, and it was a bit more a way of discovering something?
No, I was over those years, a lot of it, as you say, I was working one-to-one with people, sort of helping them, through spiritual crises, helping them work with their emotional problems, all kinds of things, and also teaching. But again, what I really wanted was to be writing. And ironically, what happened is at this point when I just basically started to put out these prayers to the universe and say, I've had this writer's block forever. If I'm meant to write, let a miracle happen. I mean, that was basically my prayer. Just let a frickin' miracle happen. And what happened is suddenly online, I just found, this was in, I guess, 2009, an ad that San Francisco Examiner was looking for writers. They were just starting their online presence. And so it was just this moment in time where, as long as you could string two words together, they'd kind of try you out. And they were basically paying almost nothing, but I jumped in. And that's kind of how the universe tricked me into dissolving the writer's block, because it was all those columns. I think in the end there were several hundred, maybe 500, they eventually got edited into becoming the book. But I never could have sat down at that point in my life and just said, I'm going to write a book. I got tricked.
That's interesting. So I would imagine as well, in the course of writing all those pieces, all those short articles, or short kind of Q&A type of things, that you were getting a lot of reader feedback. So you were starting to get a sense of what was resonating with your audience.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's really how it happened. I was so grateful to be just finally, like, the stopper was out of the bottle and the stuff was pouring out of me. And, the Examiner was great because it was constant pressure. You just had to create something. I don't even know if they did spell checks. It was just like, let's get it up there. And so they just constantly, it pushed me into that place of literally like unplugging the tube. But it's, as you say, I think because the nature of the writing I do, it was so important right from the beginning that it have an authentic voice. And there's so much sort of spiritual gobbledygook out there that's, either very hard to read because it's overly philosophical, or it just isn't telling people on a practical level, how the hell do you do this?
Yeah.
How do you actually invite this in? That I somehow was finding in the course of those short columns, that was what excited me, was to tell people on a really practical level, hey, you can do this. Let me show you how, and be funny about it and whatever. So yeah, the feedback right away, it got a pretty, I almost want to say like a cultish audience. It got this audience that were just there all the time. Like, okay, what's the next piece? What's the next piece? So I realized there was a hunger for that kind of approach, and then it eventually turned into the book.
And it reminds me a little bit. There's an English philosopher called Alain de Botton, and he actually says that actually philosophy, a lot of philosophy philosophers have been completely failing philosophy for the past 50, 100 years, because they put it into this academic thing that's all in the head, and actually doesn't do what philosophy should do, which is give guidance on how to live, and how to live a good life. And going back to the Greeks and way before that as well, where you had people, these were kind of guides, they were kind of thinking about problems for you. And he said a lot of modern philosophy, that's really failed, because at the end of it, you kind of read these great philosophical tomes and you go, You asked the Miles Davis question, like, so what? Okay, so
That's it.
how does that help me as well? And I saw something you spoke at the at Google when the Google talks, and
Yeah.
so, and obviously you're writing a lot in the atmosphere of being in the Bay Area, where there's a lot of coders and a lot of folks like that who are very rational minded. They think in a certain type of way. So I would have thought there might have been a bit of pushback towards a kind of
Yeah.
spirituality when you go and speak at Google.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting experience because I was laughing when it happened because I thought on the one hand, okay, they must have a certain measure of openness to this, maybe because of the Yale background. So they kind of figure, all right, that environment of being in that high pressure type A thing is not foreign to me. I'm not going to come in there like some new age woo woo or something. But what was interesting is I think it's surprising in that world, almost as a response to that world, you get a certain number of people that are absolutely hungry for, they're tired of staring at their screens. They're tired of only using one part of their mind, or they're actually very open to the idea that, even the world of computers is actually deeply creative, and the hugest creative breakthroughs come through the intuition. And the intuition is, to me, the core of the divine. So it really wasn't that hard to sort of link some of it up. But I have to admit, there were definitely some messages that were people like, what are we doing listening to this woman talk about spirituality? And, I was laughing at those. Like, they were like, really? Do we need this? So I think there were both sides. And that's fun for me. I didn't, expect it all to be like, yeah, bring on the meditation.
Because and I believe now their most popular class that they teach at Google is a mindfulness class.
I was going to say it's really been opening over, there's supposedly a very big mindfulness class now, and I think it's really, some guy wrote me after that event, and he said I sort of snuck into the back of the room and didn't want anybody to know I was there, and then he said I went and I bought all the books after, and it really touched a place of me that feels like is starving. So I think that's the other side of it.
So how do you introduce people that maybe come from that? They've done their computer science background and they're very rational about the way that they think about life, and they're very big, Richard Dawkins kind of fans of thinking, it all has to make sense and it has to be something that I can measure and I can change and things. It's all about me as as a person. It comes from, it's quite individualistic and a kind of atomized way of looking at the world. How do you introduce them to the kind of spiritual teachings that you look to kind of propagate?
Well, I think, one of the first things is to just get rid of the word God, because it's such a plug for so many people, and plus it just doesn't have a very good track record in human history for oppressing people, right? So kind of like, don't use that word. And I think of it, honestly, one of the entry points is to really say to people, when have you known something without knowing how you know it? Like go pick an experience, come to something, whether it was that, sorry, that thing keeps going off. I'm trying to figure out how to get that beeper off without cutting the rest of this off, but she'll stop. So, because almost everybody, even the most rational people, like my own brother, they'll go back and he's like, yeah, the minute I met my wife, I knew. Or, they'll have something like that. I knew when I walked into this certain job, I was going to get it. And I think if you can track people to that place where they're beginning to honor the intuition and then begin to connect, well, what is that intuition? That intuition is part of something larger that is trying to communicate with you all the time. But we live in a culture that teaches us not to honor it. And it's, I think it's beginning from that place is often really helpful. And even just beginning from the place of befriending yourself from the inside, befriending that force of love from the inside. Because let's say I know you're talking about computers, but I would apply it to anything, let's say with somebody wanting to be more creative in their life. It's that idea of, the inner self as an adversary that somehow kind of has to be, pummeled into submission or whipped harder to work more or to, get that next chapter out. That this is, I found, is absolutely different. It's about befriending that inner love. It becomes this ally that deepens and deepens and then actually takes over the creative process through you. And I think it's really like the same thing when, I don't know, was it Michelangelo or whoever said it, like he basically said, I don't do anything. I just get rid of what's asking to leave.
Yeah.
And that anybody, to me, that's really creating something of value, it's not the ego doing it. It's something larger through them. So these are all techniques for how to get out of the way of that.
So what is the role of the ego, or is there a role for the ego in creativity? Because you look at if we look at these people that are considered as great creatives, and you mentioned Apple, so with Steve Jobs, or whether it's Mick Jagger, or whether it's whoever it is, there's people that are seen as really kind of very creative folks. A lot of that time, you also hear that they have pretty sizable egos as well.
Yeah.
So where does ego sit within all this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's different in different. It's almost to me like, how does the universe want to use you as a vehicle? I mean, I love Mick Jagger, so I kind of thinking about that. Like I'm thinking, you watch this guy on stage, and clearly there's a supernatural force taking over. I don't know if he would agree, but it's like you just look at this and you're like, there's something bigger than just his ego running the show. The fact that he's been doing it for 60 years up there, it's like insane, right? But on the other hand, I think to some extent, especially for some people, the ego is like the organizing principle. It's like it becomes the vehicle for the personality. But if it's only the ego, and I think it's easier to see with, well, I mean, I can give my own example. When the ego was running the writing was quite terrible. It was very. The ego doesn't tend to want to take chances in that sense. I mean, I found, at least for a lot of people, it's quite conservative. I mean, it's like, will they like me? Won't they like me? How do I do this? I mean, it tends to have that whole orientation towards manipulating the outcome. And so I think it's there. It gives you a core. Otherwise you wouldn't see yourself as different than a tree. I mean, it gives you a sense that there is a you, but I think at some point, whether it's conscious or not, you can begin to invite something larger than that to move through you.
So it's almost like a convention. It's a useful convention up to a certain point, and then you have to go.
Like a container, maybe, And then I think, years ago, I was teaching creativity classes per se. I mean, it was back when I was getting the examiner column going, and people were like, how do you get rid of a writer's block? So I did some classes on that. And one of the things, that I would say, like people kept saying, my writing, my stuff, how do I get it out there? How do I get this? And it was all very based in my. And so that was one of the things that had happened to me through the examiner column is I was like, you know what, just drop the fixation on the my and start to think of it as the writing, the art, the stuff, because that invites what's greater than the ego. And
it's funny. I mean, I filmed a podcast, a video about this recently. This thing of the creative genius as being the I, as the individual, is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, it's basically from the Renaissance. It came about, and before that, if you were the way the Greeks or the Romans would talk about genius was you were a vessel, things flowed through you.
Yes.
So as a result, you couldn't take all the credit for it, which is one good thing.
That.
But on the other side, it means that you don't have to also take all the responsibility if it's not maybe going well, you're kind of blocked for something because it's. But we changed in the Random Renaissance where the people like Vasari, the great writers on the artist, would suddenly say this person is creative. It's that person's individual. Now, that's great from a perspective of maybe giving someone a bit of a nice ego boost, but actually it can be quite detrimental to someone's creativity because it puts a lot of pressure on that individual.
That's it. That's it. And then when somebody's, especially in the block, they're constantly like, my block, and what do I do to get rid of my block? When, one of the main principles in both books is the concept of offering. So it's not that any of this is bad or wrong. It's that if the creativity itself, the writing, the art, whatever it is actually offered back to love, it's offered back to the divine, which in a way is what I was doing when that column came along. And I basically just said to the divine, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I haven't written in 30 years. Start to write through me. That act of offering, of invitation, that's what I would say. It's a really heartfelt invitation to something larger than the limitations of the ego. I was desperate. I had to. And I think I kind of got tricked into doing what would end up, becoming a main piece of how I teach.
But I suppose as well, this idea of, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners will resonate, this idea of writing the book. That sounds like a really scary thing. Writing a book. I mean, it sounds like a big chunky thing where you were doing your articles, and I suppose this is where blogging can be quite useful for people as well, because you don't have to write a book. You can explore a series of ideas, and then a lot of really great writers today they've taken some of the best pieces of their blogs, what's resonated with the audience, and where they've been able to find themes, and then put them together finally in a book as an eventual book.
Yes, and I think it's true. I think people sort of scare the bejesus out of themselves with these grand visions of how it has to go and what has to happen, and then they just become completely paralyzed because the first step isn't even doable, let alone this grand vision. And as soon as you bring it back down to releasing the I, offering it all to this, literally to that force of genius, to that force of love, as soon as it's offered back, then you can actually say to it, now show me the first step. Is there something of value here? I also really feel this. It's quite different when you're offering it for the benefit of the planet and for the benefit of your readers, as opposed to just like, make me famous. You know what I mean? Like, it just comes from a more noble place. It really changes things. I remember listening to somebody talk once about, how they got up and they spoke in front of thousands of people. It was this woman who gave all these talks, and she said, I basically just pray before I get out there, let me be useful, like, let me help them, they're suffering. And that's so different than, oh my God, there's 5,000 people there, what are they going to think of me?
Yeah. And the thing is, those 5,000 people out there, they kind of want you to to do well. They don't want to be somewhere that's like a bad gig.
They don't want to be stuck with you.
So you've already kind of partly got them on side anyway, because they're rooting for whoever comes up to speak to do it well.
It's true.
So to tell us about a time in your life where you've worked on some kind of creative project and you've given it your heart and your soul, but for whatever reason it just hasn't worked out like you'd hoped. And more importantly, what were the lessons that you took away from that experience?
Wow, that's interesting. Actually, well, in a way, it might be actually where I am right now. But again, I would say it's quite different because I really live from the perspective of offering. So when you come from that place of saying, well, I gave it my all and I wanted this to happen and da-da-da, it's kind of evolved to a place where, I know it may sound crazy to some people listening, but I have an idea of what I might like to happen, but because it's truly offered to the divine, I'm open to what the universe wants to bring instead. So, basically, right now, I sort of had thought in my maybe egoic head that by this point I would have a very clear idea of where the next book would go.
So
because...
in terms of your creativity, it sounds like a little bit like you put the thing out there, you want it to do the best, you do your best at the craft of the thing you're doing, but then also having that ability to not grasp at it
That's
and
it.
to let
That's
go.
exactly it. That's exactly it. And I'd say that's actually the core of offering things is it releases you from the net of grasping. And grasping is the killer of
Now,
the creativity.
now I can hear some of my
Yeah.
listeners who type A personality, and we've got a lot of real kind of
Yeah, yeah.
go-getter type, and this idea of just putting something out there and then not being fixated on making sure everything's going to work on it and all the
Yeah.
details and dotting the I's and
Yeah.
crossing the T's, that's quite a scary concept.
But wait a second. I want to clarify what that actually means because it doesn't mean being sloppy and not crossing
So
the T's. No,
this is
this
useful
has
to know.
nothing to do with being sloppy. It actually also has nothing to do with being passive. What it actually means, I mean, the example I was really going to use is both those two books really came out like clockwork, and then the mind comes in. It's like, oh well, just pop out a third book, but truthfully, it's like you start to trust the timing and the process, kind of the same way in nature. Things bloom when they want to bloom. And so it's almost like what is happening is it's like the message is like, no, 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 sit with this for a while. You're not like a machine that's just going to keep popping out books because that's when the bad writing happens, is my experience. So let this germinate and gestate for as long as it needs, and then it will present itself on its own in the right time, in the right way. Now, when it does, you go kick ass. This isn't about being, passive. It's like when the inspiration comes, and that was happening during Change Me prayers, I was just writing like 22 hours a day. I was like, I couldn't turn it off because you are in the flow of what's happening, but it's not from that place of should and force and push and have to and beat yourself up if you didn't write today. That's the stuff I'm talking about, is that when the ego has the wheel, there's just this place of so much push and tension and shoulds and competition, and that starts to fall away, and people they'll understand it so much better especially if they start with the book Outrageous Openness, because the subtitle is letting the divine take the lead. And it just shows on a really practical level, how do you do this so that something larger is invited to come through when it's time to act? Oh my Lord, you're acting. I mean, there's a lot to do. So it's really not, like lying there on your back hoping some heavenly force takes over. It's really the release of the grasping so that right action comes at the right time.
And in this creative journey that you've gone through as a writer, as a teacher, tell us about any insights or light bulb moments in your life, times when you've said, okay, this is the direction I need to go with the writing or the work that I'm doing, or something that's just something come to you where you say, okay, this is important, I need to take note of this.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, one of the things that happened along the way pretty early, again, from maybe even those examiner columns, is I just realized how much I cared about writing with humor. And that's sort of ironic for somebody coming from a philosophical sort of academic background, but I could just feel how, so many of the even the performers that I loved out there were pretty much, a comic of some kind or another, and that there was this role historically that you could just say all kinds of truths as long as you were funny. And, that was very different than like lecturing people or being pedantic or, telling people how they should be living. It's like if you were funny, you had an entree into all kinds of people, even Google people. It's like, it's just this universal connection for, so that was actually a big piece that was surprising, and as it's just sort of come up naturally. I think what happens is you just start to realize who you actually are and who you're not. And so, I think another piece of it was that I wanted to help people that fine line, I guess we're talking about it right now, of how to, this isn't being sloppy, and yet how to not be so hard on themselves, because that was, I think, what I had carried from my time in college, is this way that people can just be their absolute worst critics. And yet at the same time, you don't want to be sloppy, so that if what you're writing really has no merit, you kind of go, all right, this really wasn't very good. Let's jump in again and offer it back to this force of love. And I just had this happen, actually. I got a letter from a woman. She had been a ballet dancer in the New York Ballet. And for years, she'd wanted to write about her experiences behind the scenes there. And she just had so much self-criticism about, how she was telling the story, what she was doing, blah, blah. And she finally just applied this. She was just like, I'm offering it with my whole heart to this force of love, and saying, if this is a message that people can benefit from, open the way and let me write this book. And that book just got published. And she wrote me this letter, and she's like, the small self egoic I could not have written this book. It was impossible. And that opening, that invitation for something larger to take over is what let it happen. And, yes, of course, like when it comes out, she'll get the credit, she'll get the press, and that's fine. But she's well aware of the fact that something bigger took over. And I think, that's really my passion in this, is what happens when you do that.
So how do you... Yeah, how do you begin to chip away then at that little voice that says, "You're not writing this right. That's stupid. That's not going to work." How do you start chipping away at that little voice to open yourself up as a creative, whether you're a writer, or as a songwriter, or as a composer, an artist, whatever your thing is?
Yeah.
How do you start to open out and become more authentic and quieten that part of the ego?
Well, I partly think it really is this act of the offering that anybody could do. It's like you just can do it, even if you're very cynical. I kind of like the skeptics. I mean, both my brothers are really skeptical, so I kind of grew up with this. And you can be quite skeptical, and you can still say, hey, I have nothing to lose. I'm speaking to my own intuition. Everybody believes in the intuition, and I'm saying to it, let me give this writing to you, to something larger than just this ferocious ego critic. So you literally are offering it to the greater self to carry the burden of the writing. So that's one piece. And then you really can have for some people, you offer it over and over and over again. I mean, when I was dealing with there's 3 books out at this point, and it's like every one of them, I had to just keep offering it. It's like a muscle that you build up. But I think the other side, there's a good part, the morning pages technique.
Yeah, the Julia Cameron.
From Julia Cameron. I do like that piece of it. I mean, I haven't always done it in her exact way, but I think this idea that you just let stuff pour out. You give yourself like a free zone where you're kind of just saying to the ego, go watch a movie, do something else. I'm going to write for a while and actually not particularly interested in what you have to say about it. You can talk to me later. Is quite freeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if I had we had a previous guest on who's Rolf Kent, who's a very successful film writer in LA, who did music for Up in the Air and Sideways, and a lot of great movies.
Yeah,
and he does morning pages every day. And the way he expressed it was a kind of flow of consciousness thing for him, and also it was almost just a way of like lightweight training for the creativity.
Yes. I love that. I actually think that's true. I mean, ironically, what happened to me with that is that eventually, I don't always do it every day anymore, but for a long time I was doing it on Facebook, because I was just finding, I had a Facebook author page, and I just was finding that there was this audience that was like, hey, this is great, and they'd give immediate feedback. So it was kind of like morning pages with people happy that they were getting the writing, and then I was happy because I would be getting their responses. So I think there's some really fun ways to do that. But but I think for some people it's like, no, I don't want that feedback. I just need it for
For
myself.
myself.
But
And
you
then
know,
you obviously teach a lot of people now through your books and your online courses. What's the best advice that you've ever received around creativity and being living a creative life?
well, oh goodness, same person. I would say it's get out of the way. And again, you could say, what does that mean? How do you get out of the way? And I would say, go get both my books and you'll find out. Because I think that this idea of honing the ego to become better and better at what it does only goes so far. And then this idea that there's something so far beyond what the ego could dream up. I mean, Einstein said it himself, like when he said, no problem can be solved from the level of consciousness that created it. That's really one of the things that I hold to a lot is like you're at this place creatively where you want this thing to come out or whatever, just hammering at it from the level of the ego is still the same constricted consciousness.
And is there a personal habit that you have that you think contributes to your openness and you being able to live this kind of life that you live?
I pray my buns off. I mean, that's the truth. And I'm not a religious person. I mean, I'm not, it's none of that. I really think that there's a way to build an inner dialogue with that force of love inside of you and that anyone can do it. And it's actually ironic, here in the States, there's all that madness with, Valentine's Day coming up. And as much as I'm a romantic, there's this way that force of love can also be seen on the inside, so that whether there's someone on the outside or not, you have somebody you're celebrating Valentine's Day with. So that's really how I operate is like you build that connection on the inside and praying or an inner dialogue, an inner bowing. I really love the poems of like Hafez and Rumi, if you're familiar with them. They were Sufi poets, and they wrote a lot about really how to just honor that inner love. It'll bring everything. So that's what I think, and I think all my writing is really about that, and anyone can do it.
And is there a online resource or a tool that you love, like a Evernote or something that you really you find valuable?
Oh, you mean for the writing itself?
For the writing and for the kind of creative work that you do.
Well, do you know the Scrivener's thing?
Yeah, I love Scrivener.
Yeah, I love that too. I mean, that was kind of a revelation for me because I have a bit of ADD. So I was like constantly losing. I was just like writing this stuff going, oh, wow, that's really inspired. I have no idea where it is on the computer. I never even named it. So when I found Scrivener's, I was like, wow, this is the like, galactic, perfection for anybody who's disorganized. So
it's a great tool. I'll put that on the show notes. People listen, if they go to jamestaylor.me and just type in Tosha Silver, they'll be able to find the links to all these as well. And if you could recommend just one record and one book to our listeners.
Oh my God, you didn't warn me that you were going to do this.
Now, usually the musicians hate having to choose a record, and the writers hate having to choose a book. So that's why you can choose one record and or a book. It's up to you.
Oh my God. You know what's so crazy? I mean, all that you're going to get is what I'm listening to right now.
Well, that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
For whatever reason, I'm on a binge right now with Amy Winehouse.
Oh.
Because I had just seen the movie that had come out about her life. I don't know if you saw it.
No, I haven't seen it.
But it's quite, I mean, I just think she was a genius in her own way and kind of an example of like, where if you don't build that relationship of love on the inside, how tragic it can get. But any of her albums are kind of at the moment what I've been listening to. And boy, for a book, I am actually at the moment reading M Train by Patti Smith. So, you know, Patti Smith,
Yeah, yeah.
the old, yeah. So actually, she's turning out to be an amazing writer. I had no idea. Somebody had written me, and they said, you will be so inspired by her writing. She had another book called Just Kids, and then M Train, and they both got in the National Book Award in the States here. And she is an amazing writer. It really, I've, you know, like I say, been in that place of going, what's my next book going to be? And ironically, I'm getting inspired by her sort of autobiographical but edgy way of writing. So,
Fantastic.
and she's quite spiritual in her own way.
And we'll put all these down in the show notes as well. And final question for you, Tosha. Let's imagine if you woke up tomorrow morning and had to start from scratch. So you have the tools of your trade, which I imagine is like Scrivener and a computer to be able to write and teach, and the knowledge that you've acquired over these years of music, but no one knows who you are. You don't have a list, don't have a following. How would you restart things?
I'd go back on Facebook. You know, sometimes I've thought about, like, for all the evil that people attribute to Facebook, that place has really saved my butt because, you know, even when I had the column, the reach through Facebook was so much more immediate and fulfilling. And so I would literally just go back on Facebook and just be like, well, there's 5 people here that are curious about what I have to say. Let me give them something.
Great.
You know, I mean, because I think that's the key is if it's like, let me give, as opposed to like, how can I convince people that I'm great? That's what changes everything.
Well, Tosha, thank you so much for coming on the show. Share the best way that listeners can connect with you, learn more about your books and your online courses.
You know, if they just go to Tosha Silver, just my name, toshasilver.com, and they'll find on there like on the homepage, there's the Living Outrageous Openness Forum, which is the teaching program that anyone can join. It's like a monthly program with people from all over the world, and there's lots of other classes. There's lots of recordings. There's the books. There's everything. And they can also get on Facebook to the author page, and like the author page.
Great. Well, Tosha, thank you so much for coming on the show. I wish you all the best with the next book. I look forward to reading it when it comes out as well.
Thank you so much, James. It was really a pleasure to talk with you. You know what? Can I throw one quick thing your way?
Absolutely.
All right. I really want to know what your answer would be to the music thing.
Which one? Oh, favorite album, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, like when people say something like that, I'm like thinking, okay, what would you say? Yeah.
I would probably say, for me, it changes all the time as well. The record that I would probably gift most, actually, I'm going to change it. The record that I'm probably telling the most people about just now is by actually the gentleman I mentioned, Rolf Kent, which is it's called the Zen Effect. And Zen Effect 2, which is it's kind of meditation music, I suppose. You could use it for yoga, and it's using long tones in terms of in different things. And it's actually very useful. It's very useful, I find, as a writer. If I'm doing any kind of work where, I don't want to be an active listener. I want to be just have something come over, and I think that's very useful. And in terms of the book I probably gifted to more people is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Oh, okay.
Which is a classic kind of Stoic philosopher.
I know the Stoics well. I really like them.
And I think this
because they didn't mess around.
They didn't mess around, and I think they were the European Buddhists. I would say there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, thank you so much, and all the best in the future.
You too. Bye.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.